So how do we get and who decides our identity? Anybody start out. How do we get our identity? How do you know who you are?
Who claims you?
Who claims you, right? Your parents? Yeah. Or
Your tribal nation.
Your tribal nation, right? Right. Go ahead.
I think geographics can play a role too.
Yeah.
Where you are geographically.
Tell me what you mean. Give an example.
Kind of like what we've been learning about different tribes being from different areas and like kind of the geographic location. I guess you can say like, for example, anything from. I guess I'm going to tie myself up here, but yeah, just geographics, I guess.
No. I wasn't trying to embarrass you, Shay. No, it's an excellent statement, and I'm Alaska Native, right? But that doesn't designate my tribe. So yeah, regions, right? Other ideas. Who defines who you are besides your community? Yourself, right? Where do you get that? How do you get that from? Where do you get that from? Your image of yourself. We don't think about it usually, do we? No, we just are. Has anybody traveled to a foreign country here? Or did you notice that all of a sudden you're aware of who you are as someone from the United States? Yeah, it's a different sentiment. Otherwise, we wouldn't think about it, right? Even though a lot of us did think about it before, but I don't think I ever identified myself as an American citizen, right? I always identified myself as Native, Filipino, all these other things, but never that. So that's a very strong sense. How else do you identify yourself? If there's something in the chat, let me know too. Go ahead.
From the culmination of all your experiences?
No.
A big
No.
part of it.
Yeah. Do other people ever define who you are? People who you don't know? Give me an example. Someone give me an example where that happened to them. Growing up in Juneau, Alaska, people often didn't know. I mean, they just made an assumption that I was Native. So they started to define who I was, right? Was it correct? Not necessarily. They didn't know that I was also Filipino, white, other things. But they helped form my perception of who I was, right? For a time. Other examples. Go ahead.
Being a female, like people start to make assumptions and like treat you a certain way too. So
Yeah. That helps form your identity, doesn't it? Right. Go ahead.
Two folks in the chat said naming ceremony, and another one said Bureau of Indian Affairs defines who I am, frowny face.
Oh, we have some Native alumni. Woohoo! Awesome. Big wedge for those guys and gals, whomever. Say the first one again.
Naming ceremony.
Naming ceremony, right? So you get some identity again from your traditions, your culture, right? And then the second one?
BIA defines who I am.
Yeah. And what do they mean by that? Anybody? Go ahead.
You have to be like a certain blood quantum or whatever in order to actually be a member of a tribe. So it's up to the federal government's recognition of your tribe and your tribal constitution as to whether or not you're actually native.
Right, right. We talked about this a lot in our class already, but we haven't hit on all the different facets. So you're saying it's your tribe's right, and then someone else is also saying it's the BIA. So the tribe through the BIA, is that what you're saying? Explain that a little bit better, or not better, more. Sorry, you did it.
Yeah. So tribal constitutions essentially have to be accepted through the federal government and through the BIA specifically in order to become a federally recognized tribe. So blood quantum is often built into that, and the origination of these tribal constitutions came from the BIA through templates. And so that's where blood quantum came from. It wasn't that it was a requirement, but essentially these things that are outlined within our tribal constitutions have to eventually be approved by the feds in order to be accepted or whatever.
Excellent. Go ahead.
I'd say people often will give you definitions or identities based on your experiences, traumas, physical illnesses, mental illnesses, and things like that.
Right. Again, other people imposing their perceptions of your identity. And do you take some of that on? What? Do you ever take it on yourself? Yeah. Right. Right. Getting back to, anybody else want to add to that BIA definition? Anybody, tell me if there's something comes in the chat too. So do all tribes adhere to that, to the quantum?
No.
No. What else do they use?
Lineal descent.
Lineal descent, right? Can you explain that?
In the case of my tribe, we have our specific role, the Dawes role. And so if you can prove via documentation that you come from somebody on the roll, then you are Cherokee.
Right. Go ahead. Madison.
So my tribe also does lineal descent, but we do something a little differently where every single person has to be voted in by the general council. So even if you can prove lineal descent, you have to be voted in on top of that.
So what do you think about that?
I think it's a little crazy. I understand why they did it, and there's a lot of history behind why we changed our rules to be where you have to be voted in. You also have to be under the age of 8 to be applicable to be voted in. And that happened in the last like 10 years. And so it's causing a lot of chaos, but I've never met another tribe that does it that way.
For whom? Who's it cause chaos for?
For a lot of people, like a lot of the older people in the tribe that either were recently disenrolled or their paperwork was lost during the original, like during their enrollments. And like, it's just a bunch of different situations.
We've talked about that in class. What happens when they are disenrolled?
Right. Oh, you're asking me to
Mhm.
explain?
Mhm.
So they're no longer considered citizens of the nation.
Mhm.
And so they, so I'm enrolled, my grandmother is enrolled, my cousins are enrolled, my brother's enrolled. My mom's not enrolled because she was disenrolled. And so she can't access like healthcare. They have houses on the rancheria that are for elders.
Mhm.
And if she was in that age range, she wouldn't be able to get a house there. She's not technically invited to ceremony, but there's new people in leadership now. So we think that that might change. There's also like new bylaws coming in. So people in her situation can be voted back in. It's just a whole nightmare. Yeah.
Anybody else comment on that one? Oh, go ahead.
Another thing that could impact that is if they're in the foster system, like, so my tribe also does lineage enrollment. And my mom was in the foster care system, so she didn't find out about her connection until she was an adult. And so she would have been 18. And at that point, if they're only 8, and then I was older than 8 as well, so that would have impacted my enrollment, and that's kind of triggering.
Yeah, traumatic.
Yeah, my tribe is actually considering going back to our kinship making rituals, so we can bring in like people that adopt children and want them to be part of the tribe, like going through kin making rituals so they can actually be in the tribe, be considered part of the tribe. I think that's an interesting direction. We're real fast and loose with it recently. It's crazy. We're going through a metamorphosis.
And how, in these instances where it's pretty harmful, or it's, we're hearing about trauma, how should we handle that? You as a tribal member, or you as an outsider? Say, do I, as a person who is a leader in Native health, do I have anything to do with your tribe's decision, or should I have anything to do with your tribe's decision? Should anybody outside of your tribal members?
That's a loaded question. I don't think people outside of the nation hold on, because that's confusing, because technically I think that people like my mom who have been recently disenrolled
Yeah.
or who had their paperwork lost during enrollment should have a say.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
still part of the tribe, but I don't like the doctors at our clinic who aren't part of our nation. I don't really think that they should have much of a say.
Why not? Even though it's traumatic, it's harming their patients, so why shouldn't they?
But it's not their community. It's in a way, I guess it is, because you are serving the community, but it's such an intimate thing, right? And I think it should be really decided by the people that are being the most directly impacted by it.
Other thoughts on it? Go ahead.
I just have a question of, like, kind of bring it to kind of the physician in your tribe, like you said, where the patients are being affected by it. When we say like have a say, or is it, I don't think that the physician should be on any sort of like formal board, but would it be appropriate for the physician to talk to someone who is in charge or like is on a formal board and say, with, coming forward with respect and just saying, hey, as a physician, I just want you to know this is what I'm seeing. Like when we say have a say,
Yeah.
I don't think it should be.
Other thoughts? Appreciate that. What are we getting at? What's the key here that we're getting at?
Complex.
What's that?
It's complex.
Yeah, it's complex, but what's at the crux of all this discussion?
Autonomy.
Autonomy, exactly, sovereignty. It's the sovereign right of that tribe. And we have talked many times about the key, how important autonomy and sovereignty is to our health outcomes, right? So absolutely, can a physician from outside, can other people from outside say, hey, you know, I've seen this harms people? Yes, you can give that input. Do we have a right still to be part of that final decision-making? No, it's part of the tribe. Is it frustrating at times? Yes. The Association of American Indian Physicians wrote a position paper a few years ago about disenrollment and how harmful it is to our tribal nations. But do we tell the tribal leaders how to run things? No, absolutely not. So until we get elected tribal leaders ourselves in those communities, then we don't. So good. Besides our identity, Dana, you made some really good points. Other people outside, you know, with other diagnoses, right? We see that all the time in medicine. We give a diagnosis and that kind of starts to define who somebody's identity, right? So it's something that we have to be aware of as physicians. Has anybody ever been told or had anybody walk up to them and ask them, are you this tribe or that tribe, or make assumptions and tell them what tribe they think they're from? Maybe they don't do that anymore. When I was growing up, seemed to be a thing where older people would come up to me and say, oh, you must be Inuit or this or that tribe. Got really old really fast. So there's that gets thrown into the mix when you're a younger person, all that. You know, it'd be strange. Can you imagine anybody walking up and saying, well, you must be from this region of Norway? Or it's hard to even cross over and explain how weird that is. How do we maintain our identity? Anything in the chat? Okay, how do we maintain our identity?
Ceremony.
Ceremony, yeah, that's one way, yep. Good. How else do we maintain our identity? And tell me more about ceremony. Are you talking about native ceremony or?
Yeah, like a central piece of being a member of my tribe is being a part of ceremony, or at least for me anyways. So if I'm not attending ceremony, then it's hard to maintain the whole part of being Lakota.
And what does your ceremony, are there any facets of your ceremony that connect to your identity in particular?
Yeah, I think our ceremonies, essentially, so we live by 7 different laws and our ceremonies all take that into account. So, I mean, wellness and like the medicine wheel and having a balance of your health and wellness is central to who you are. And so ceremony is one part of that, I guess, but then it also integrates our 7 laws.
Right, so tying that identity again into health. Ceremony. Are Native people the only people, I'll get you in a second, Dana. Are any Native people the only people who have ceremony that ties to their identity or maintains their identity? No, of course not. I saw a nodding head up there. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I think that like 2 examples I have is when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Gambia, like there were ceremonies that like I participated in with my community that I lived in that were like integral, that they like naming ceremonies, for example. That's something that like helped to maintain their identity, and they would invite like for living there for half years, like they would invite people in to be part of their community if they felt they were trusted. And then bringing those things back to America, now I have that connection with members here, and that's helped to maintain my own identity as like part of those communities in a different way. So that's something that is now part of my own identity.
Others? What other kind of ceremony? Go ahead.
In the chat, it says relationship within our tribal community, leadership and clan roles.
Absolutely, yeah. That's one of the reasons that we, remember we introduced, I talked about how you introduce yourself, is telling where you are, where in that relationship, all those relationships to your community and to one another, to your families. Dana had her hand up and then I'll go to you, Emily. Go ahead, Dana.
I was gonna say building a community of like shared experiences and
Yeah.
understanding.
Right. If it doesn't exist already, then you might build a new one, like your community of medical students, right? that maintains your identity here, right? Go ahead, Emily.
I was gonna say one of the simplest ways that I personally maintain my identity is through speaking my language. And by being able to speak and converse in Navajo, it's a lot harder to do when I'm away from home. Just because so much of different ideologies are only spoken in Navajo and there's no translation to them in English at all. And so if you aren't able to speak and express yourself in those ways, it kind of feels like you're isolated from like that part of your being. And then just tacking onto the ceremonies, one specifically in Navajo that younger women have upon like first menstruation is called your kinalta. And it's where your whole family comes together. And during this 4 days, you embody a changing woman who's one of our first deities who in this fourth world, which is what we're in currently, she was the first being to bear a child. And so during that time, after your first menstruation, your whole family comes together and kind of like blesses you. There's a lot of different things, like you get up before the sun, like you go run towards the east, and your whole family's there. You grind corn all day and you bake a cake in the ground overnight. And so when I was 12, I was able to have one of those, and it's one of those things that really, when I'm struggling, I kind of just, draw from the experiences in a way that I am during that time. And so that's like one distinct version of ceremony that, even though it happened a while ago, it's something that I go back to. And when I talk to my mom or when I talk to my grandma, she tells me about, the things that were told or the ways that I was stretched and the way that I was supposed to be prepared for these trials that I'm overcoming in life now all ties back to that one ceremony that I had when I was 12.
Thank you for sharing that, Emily. That's really powerful. Did you guys in the back hear that? Okay, excellent. No, that's an excellent example of how, and can you think of a time when that might, or can you think of an instance where you might have, and it might be, you might not be able to, where interacting with our Western health system might have infringed on that, or where that might have come into conflict, those beliefs about yourself or your traditions?
Yeah, I'd say that a lot of like Western, just, if you're sick, you take a medication, you do certain things. It's always like to fix one problem. One of the big tenets that we talk about is Hojong, which is keeping like an inner type of balance to where everywhere before, so like we always say like Hojong Hasling 4 times over, which means that beauty before me, beauty behind me, beauty above me, and beauty below me. And it's all about keeping everything within your world all in balance together, and how not only like what you do impacts the world, but how the holy people and everything else around you influence your daily life. And so I think that Western medicine, by only approaching it from like one facet of that and not thinking about how the world influences you and how you also are able to radiate your own influence into the world, I feel like that kind of creates a lot of conflict too.
Well said, Miigwech.
A couple comments in the chat. One person says white coat ceremony and then graduation from various programs as a way to maintain identity. And then another person said, I also had a Kinalda ceremony as well, and it maintains identity as an embodiment of changing woman or revered matriarch throughout one's life.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing those things. White coat ceremony, a very good example. How about church? Yeah, church maintains identity for people. So it's not just, it's not unique to specific cultures, right? Can you get that door, Dana? I want to go back to one thing, Emily, that you mentioned, because not everybody has that privilege of having, language is critical for so many people. And it really, if you are able to, I hate the word privilege, if you are able to be brought up in it, then you have this distinct connection, right, to something else, something other, to a culture, to a people, to a place, right? But we've lost that. And I just want to make sure that everybody understands what it meant to have lost it. And for those of us who are regaining, does it make us any less native or anything? No, not at all. But sometimes there is a little bit of guilt. And I've had people approach me and say, why don't you know your language? This assumption about who we are again. Okay, so just be mindful of that one. We haven't all been able to, because of all the things that have happened. All right, what else did I want to say about identity, lineage, right, lineage, just remembering matrilineal and patrilineal. So in Western society, we always assume patrilineal, but in a lot of our societies, it's actually matrilineal, like in mine. And that has some significant impacts. For instance, in my family, in our traditional lines, it's the uncles who raise the sons, and that keeps both sides, both moieties, the ravens and eagles, tied together in some way, because the uncle is from a different moiety than the dad would be of that child. Now it gets confusing, but different ways that we bind one another together and maintain the identity as well. All right. Anything else on who decides our identity? Anything else in the chat? Anything else on how we maintain our identity?
I was just thinking about how like felons can't vote or whatever, or so like your past kind of can affect your future too.
And change your identity. Great. Oh, excellent. Thank you. Go ahead, someone over here.
Oh, it's me. This is kind of odd, but I think cuisine is extremely important.
I'm sorry.
Cuisine, what you're eating.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's just because I love food, but and this kind of ties into what I kind of meant geographically earlier. You're kind of a product of the environment you're in and the resources that are available to you.
Yeah.
And so a lot of cultures, you gain a lot of personal connection through the process of creating those foods and different cuisines. And yeah, and it kind of made me think of that one famous native or indigenous
Sous chef?
sous chef that we talked about. So
Right. Yeah. No, that's an excellent point. Harvesting is a part of the culture, which is a part of the community, which brings people together and maintains their identity. Yeah, excellent. I saw here, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of like off what Shane said, like just the other day, I was really feeling kind of like down and out, just like mentally, like was really missing home. And like my friend Andy, she's like, hey, like, do you want like some carne asada and rice that like my boyfriend make? And that's a traditional dish that like in my house we make all the time, and I haven't had it once since coming up here. And so when she brought that over, it just like really made me feel so safe, and it made me feel like I could breathe again. It made me like comfort back to like who I was.
Yeah.
And it was just really calming.
Yeah.
It was really simple, but it made me feel a lot better.
Thanks. Yeah. I see another hand raised. Go ahead, Madison.
I think another really powerful way of maintaining your identity that seems really simple is just claiming it, like telling people this is who I am. So for my grandmother, she grew up with like a lot of ambivalence towards telling people outside of our nation and that she was Native. Like her sister got sick when she was younger, so she spent a lot of time in San Francisco and went to some schools there, and just like having to tell people that you're Native got exhausting to her. And also it was like the 40s or something. So it was not a good time to tell people you were Native there either. And when she got older, she got more comfortable talking about it. And you could like, even though, you know, I only saw her through, you know, up and she passed, but anyway, so the time that I saw her, I could tell the difference from when I was really young to when I was like in my teens, and she was much more open and honest about her identity and experience, and also influenced my parent, like my mom and my aunts and stuff, to be more honest about who they were too. And so just that generational release was really powerful.
Yeah, it is such an important factor for people today. Go ahead.
I think that kind of connects with the product of your environment as well, whereas right now, we're in a generation that's going to be defined by living through a pandemic. And probably a couple generations before, I'm not sure how if everyone remembers 9/11, that was obviously a life-changing event for a lot of people, Vietnam War, World War II, and going through those experiences, your experience is going to be part of that, you know, that generation that defined your group is very different than ours.
Yeah, excellent point. Yeah. But I saw another hand go up. Go ahead.
I was just thinking about the connection between identity and location. And I think that applies in many different ways. Like I think about when I'm talking to people in the place where I'm from, a lot of times those connections like, oh, well, where do they live? Oh, do they know so-and-so in that town? Or how an experience I had when moving from like a small town to a large city was like missing seeing the stars, or like missing that sense of I feel comfortable here. I know how this place operates, and that like sense of safety and being in the location that's familiar to you.
So how can all these discussions apply to health for you as future clinicians? What can you take out of this? Go ahead, Dana.
Kind of like a left field thought, I guess. I feel like everybody is craving identity in some way, and we always have like those BuzzFeed quizzes or like stuff like that, or like, oh, which Harry Potter character, whatever. But like that kind of thing where people are looking for some sort of way to attach themselves and find themselves. And I feel like it's especially with adolescence and teenage years where that can really become, you know, issues with your mental health and something that you need to take consideration with like social determinants as well, and like those kind of factors with your patient, and thinking about, you know, you can feel lost when you don't have that attachment or you're not fully there. And I think that plays a big role in not just your mental health, your physical health, spiritual health, emotional health, and all that I feel is very encompassing of that person. I think identity is a big role in medicine.
Yeah, no, well said. I think though, one of the points of what you're making is that they're looking for that connection to community, not just defining themselves, but who are their group, right? Who do they relate to? Who relates to them? Who can form that support behind them, right? Yeah, excellent. So recognizing that as a clinician and what people might be searching for, right? And how can you help in that instance, right? Go ahead.
And I also think it takes into account why you chose a majority of us coming from rural communities, from these rural towns, with the idea of having us go back and serve. That rural, you know, you trust a member of your community more than you're going to trust an outsider. It just in the context of that, say you have I mean, in our community, we only have urban trained or urban raised docs. And so that aspect of trying to get someone who's not from the community to understand the needs and health disparities within the community is a whole nother challenge. Whereas if you have like a lot of us coming, we know, we grew up there, we grew up 30 minutes away from a healthcare system. We grew up knowing there's not public transportation or Ubers or Lyfts, and there's not that ease of getting to appointments. So I think taking that into consideration, as well as not only like cultural identity, but ethnical identity, racial identity. It's why we need more Native representation in physicians, more Latino representation, more African-American. You feel more comfortable with physicians, and as healthcare providers, you'll build a better bond if you guys can find that common identity together.
Yeah, well said. Why else do we choose you guys? Not just because you know those areas, but why else? Who's whispering?
I was just saying, we're super smart.
For the people online, they're saying they're super smart, super good looking. They think they're the bomb. Old term. No, because we know you guys are more likely to go home. The other reason we know, just like we know underrepresented minorities in medicine are more likely to serve underrepresented people, patients. That's what the data shows. And our numbers represent that, right? Our numbers tell us that that's the case. There's one other thing about identity. We talked about connection to land. What if you don't have it anymore? Do you lose your identity? Over 70% of natives now in urban areas, are they no longer natives because they're not connected to that land that they came from? Right? So how does that play out? How do they maintain their identity if they're no longer connected to the land? How might they? How do people oftentimes? Go ahead, Madison.
Me and my mom try to go back to the rancheria every year, and with mixed success rates. Usually it's just me, but sometimes it's my mom. But anyway, yeah, so people go back home and do stuff.
Yeah. That happens a lot. People from urban areas are often traveling back to our reservation communities, just like traveling back to rural communities, right? For non-natives, back and forth. Keep that connection, maintain our identity. Go ahead.
The chat say a doctor accepting the person's identity without questioning it helps to build trust in a doctor-patient. Positive identities also fuels resilience.
That's exactly right. Yep. So enforcing that person's or empowering that person and wherever they're finding their identity, right? While recognizing that their identity is fluid and changing, right? Go ahead.
I just saw something in Canada, I believe, where they were passing some sort of regulation where like intentionally misgendering somebody could be viewed as a human rights violation. And so I think that with identity too is like what that person was saying online is like acknowledging a person's pronouns and how they identify, not just culturally, well, I guess it'd be culturally, but just their pronouns and yeah. And following that gender, and you know, if you mess up, not being like, oh my God, like I'm so sorry, just being like, I apologize and I'll use it this time, you know, not making a big deal out of it, but being respectful.
Yeah, that humility again, right? I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Right. Good. There's one other piece on identity that's really important here to talk about as clinicians, as future clinicians. So we just talked about when you go to another country, all of a sudden you realize, holy Hannah, I'm an American, right? I come with all those labels, right? So that's a first awareness for some of us about who we are in a different place. But a lot of people never get that awareness of who you are compared to other people, right? Particularly in majority population, you're never challenged on it. You're never forced to think about who you are, right? Whereas people of color in general, or Native people, African American, you know, other underrepresented people, are often reminded as soon as they walk into a place, it's different than them, right? I walk into a clinic, there are no Native images up on the clinic. Well, my clinic, there are, obviously, I'm in a tribal clinic, but you know, if I walk into a non-Native one, there are no images that say, you are welcome here. We see you, you know, right? So that's a way to think about it as well. How do you make your patients know that you see them and that they belong? And it goes a long ways. The other big one is making sure that your front desk staff are aware of those issues. You know, that's the first person oftentimes a patient meets and will sometimes not return because of that. All right. Go ahead, Danny.
The tribal clinic that I just came from, it's actually really cool. We tried to integrate some of that. So instead of calling people who visit the clinic patients, they're called like, you only say relative, and even in like executive meetings and everything, you don't refer to any of the people who come to visit the clinic as a patient, they're your relative. So developing that, like I think in my future practice, I would like to integrate that because it sets you off on a different foot of like, I'm not higher than you, you're not here to just be a patient, you're my relative and I'm going to treat you like that.
I love that. In Anchorage and NUCA, the program that we talked about that's so advanced, they use, I never like this term, they use customer owner. It's like, really? Do I have to say that every time?
Yep, that's actually where it came from because we're using NUCA, so we came up with relative instead of.
Much prefer that. Pass that back to NUCA. Sorry if NUCA's on the line. So anyway, excellent. Thank you for sharing that. So these are terms that we've talked about before. Blood quantum, remember, I saw a video recently that talked about if you think about pieces of a pie, 32 pieces of a pie, half of that, so a 16th, someone might be a 16th or one half Native, it'd be 16 out of those 32 would be, but who does that, right? It just happens for Native people. Nobody else asks that, right? So just thinking about what that means and why it's so important not to ask Native people what their blood quantum is and leave that up to the tribes. Again, not all tribes use blood quantum. My tribe does, but they go down to a different level than other tribes. Some tribes use lineage, some use connections to their culture, and it's up to them because of sovereignty to decide that. Some use cultural knowledge, and we even some communities say this white guy's been around so long he just belongs to us, right? Which is pretty cool too. Or she. And then this is last. I just want to emphasize the culture, the importance of culture and in health, and how for Native people it's like. Chris and I were trying to think, is it like Wonder Woman's bracelets? Where do you know, it's our saints, it's our source of strength. It's where we get who we are, who our energy is from. It's where we're recovering our health from. That's why it's so important to maintain this in our identity, even if, and that's going to mean different things for different people. Some people it's through ceremony. Some people it's just being on the land. Some people it's connection through the language, and they might not have anything to do with these cultural ways. That's okay. It's however people define it themselves. But it's critical to ask if this can be a source of strength for people, and not just Natives, right? Where do you find your strength? Comments, other comments on that? Any chat on that one? No? Okay. That's it. That's it. I knew it was going to be a short class. I thought we'd have more discussion, but that's okay. Oh, the reading. Anybody read the poem?
Yeah.
What do you guys think about it? Some like it. Anybody hate it? Anybody understand it?
Read it 3 times and I still.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, tell me what you're
I was just
thinking.
gonna say, I think it resonates a lot with assimilation in, Western culture for natives. And I thought it was really beautiful and like funny, like, if you don't cry, you laugh, or, that kind of ideology. And I thought it was really, really cool to see. I liked it, but it was like a, brutal reality.
Tammy, how'd you perceive the poem? What did you get out of it?
So I kind of understood it as it's written by a Native person who didn't want to ever like buy into the stereotype of Native people are just like these nature granola people, but that's integral to who he is. So even as much as he didn't want to do that, or they didn't want to do that, they found themselves like constantly seeing the world in this way that like was just inherent because of who they are.
Yeah.
And so they saw the world in like this very, instead of just seeing the world, they see it as like a living being, which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
what's being Native.
Yeah, perfectly stated. Yeah, make which. Other people, thoughts on that? So that, can you, folks, I hope everybody got the chance to see the reading. If not, we'll make sure we send it to people who are online. But it's a poem written by Tommy Pico, and it's exactly as Tammy just said. It's a young person who is very much connected to who he is, or they are. I'm not sure how they identify in their pronouns.
Ellen, I have it in the chat if you want to pull it up and you could share your screen. I put it at the very top of the chat.
Oh, the poem is?
Yeah, if you open the chat, you'll be able to just pull it up and look. That second one down. No, there.
Well, thank you. You can't be an Indian person in today's world and write a nature poem. I swore to myself I would never write a nature poem. Let's be clear, I hate nature. I say to my audience, there is something smaller, I say to myself. I don't hate nature at all. Row.
Oops, I just shared it on Zoom.
Mary, you did that, Mary Russell. I don't hate nature at all. Places have thoughts, hills have backs that have love being stroked by our eyes. The river gobbles down its tract as a metaphor, but also about its day. The bluffs purr when we put down blankets at the downturn of the sun and laugh at a couple on an OBV, OK Cupid date. And even more stellar, it's my favorite line. The jelly bean moon sugars at me. She flies and beams and I breathe. Fuck that, I recant, I slap myself. Let's say I live in New York City. Let's say I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. Let's say I like watching New Girl on Hulu. This is the difference. Some see objects in the earth where I see lungs. Sky Mother falls through a hole, lands on a turtle. Hole is my favorite band. So a young person who loves land, who is so connected to land, that recognizes how the stereotype harms us and is objecting to that and says, I'm never going to write about nature. Are you kidding me? I'm not going to do what you expect me to do. I'm not going to ride a horse with a feather on my head, right? I'm not going to do that. But yet I am so connected to this. And I love this because it's that complexity that we're talking about, right? That complexity that all of us have as humans. Don't try to define who I am. I'll do it for myself. Thank you very much. And Native people are very much there, but going even I think it's even more difficult to go through this, as in some instances we're told it's terrible to be Native. Others were told, oh, it's great. You have this great lineage, blah, 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 right? So know that your patients could be on that journey somewhere. Know that they might be struggling with this. And again, not just Native people, but there are lots of different complexities of it. Go ahead.
I'll just share my personal history. So as a kid, I was told not to be proud to be Native and constantly tried to fit into these other boxes in my community. And it wasn't until college where I had the liberty to like just be who I was. And it was so liberating because it was like, wow, I don't have to try to fit into these different boxes. And recently my brother was asking me about it because he doesn't claim his Native identity. And he's like, we're not Native. And he's like, where did this come from? And I said, tell me this, did I ever fit in? Like, did I ever fit in? I always tried to, but did I? And he's like, no, you didn't. And I'm like, so I was always like trying to fit in somewhere where I didn't, and like fit into a box that I didn't. And now I just have the liberty to like be who I am and be connected to the things that like I'm connected to, rather than all of these other things that you all wanted me to be. And so I related to this a lot, in that like, as much as people tell you don't be proud of it, like it's integral to who you are, and you won't ever feel like full or whole until you're able, or at least I didn't ever feel full or whole until I was able to just step into who I am in those.
Thanks for sharing that, Tim. Remember that a lot of our young people are going through these same struggles, and that's what I really want you to think of sometimes in clinics, is how much, I mean, we all know teenage life is painful as it is, right? Ugh. Then you add this complexity on top of it, of identity. Who you want to be. All right, anybody, anything from our crowd out there? Mary, you got some wise words for us?
I was gonna say, we are all holy earth surface people. And the holy people, or whoever our deities or God, they know who we are. So in terms of our identity, we just have to find that connection, but it's always there. There's always that connection. It's just in here, we have to figure out how to get there.
Thank you for that. Excellent. Well, thanks for being here, you guys.